The morning rush hour in downtown Seattle was like clockwork. Every weekday at 7:47 a.m., the number 42 bus would screech to a halt at 3rd Avenue and Pike Street, disgorging dozens of commuters who would flood the sidewalks in their eternal race against time. Most walked with their eyes glued to their phones, earbuds blocking out the urban symphony around them. They moved like schools of fish, instinctively avoiding obstacles while maintaining their hurried pace toward glass towers and concrete office buildings. But there was one obstacle they all navigated around with particular care: the weathered man who sat against the red brick wall of the Central Library every single day. His presence had become as predictable as the morning traffic, as permanent as the bronze sculptures that dotted the downtown landscape. Yet, unlike those celebrated works of art, this human being was largely invisible to the thousands who pass him daily. Richard Morrison had occupied that same 15-foot stretch of sidewalk for 3 years, for months and 17 days. Not that anyone was counting, except for Richard himself, who kept meticulous mental notes about the patterns of his new world. He knew that the woman in the navy blue coat would drop exactly 50 cents into his weathered baseball cap every Tuesday and Friday. He knew that the teenage boy with the skateboard would nod respectfully but never make eye contact. He knew that Thursdays brought the social workers, Sundays brought the church groups, and rainy days brought fewer people but more generous donations from those who did venture out. What none of these people knew, not the commuters, not the social workers, not even the other homeless individuals who had become his closest companions, was that Richard Morrison was worth over $4 million. The secret lived in the inner pocket of his tattered brown jacket, carefully protected in a waterproof pouch that contained his real identity. Bank cards that could access accounts most people could only dream of. Investment statements showing a portfolio that generated more passive income in a month than many families earned in a year. Property deeds to a house in the upscale Magnolia neighborhood that sat empty, maintained by automatic payments, and a property management company that had long ago stopped questioning their mysterious clients' instructions. But on this particular Tuesday morning in November, as the first drops of what would become Seattle's worst early winter storm in decades began to fall, Richard's carefully constructed double life was about to unravel in ways he never could have anticipated. The day had started like any other. Richard had awakened at 5:30 a.m. in the doorway of a closed boutique 3 blocks from his usual spot, his internal clock as reliable as any expensive timepiece. He had learned long ago that the key to street survival was routine, the same wake-up time, the same route to the public restroom at the nearby McDonald's, the same breakfast of whatever he could afford or find. By 6:45 a.m., he was settling into his familiar position against the library wall, arranging his few visible possessions with the same care an executive might arrange items on an expensive desk. The cardboard sign he'd made months ago was propped against his knees. "Anything helps. God bless." The words were faded now, softened by countless rain showers and the gentle wear of daily handling. Sarah Chun was running late that morning, her usual perfectly timed routine disrupted by a client emergency that had kept her up until 2 a.m. As a junior partner at Morrison & Associates, a coincidence of names that neither she nor Richard had ever realized, Sarah had built her career on meticulous preparation and never missing deadlines. But this morning, rushing to catch up with her schedule, she almost didn't notice that something was different about the homeless man she passed every day. For over 2 years, Sarah had made it her quiet mission to acknowledge Richard's humanity. While others averted their eyes or quickened their pace when approaching his corner, Sarah would slow down, make eye contact, and offer whatever she had, sometimes money, sometimes food, always a genuine good morning, and a moment of real human connection. She had learned small things about him over time. His name was Richard, or Rich, as he preferred. He had been married once. He could discuss current events with surprising insight, suggesting he somehow stayed informed despite his circumstances. His speaking voice carried the cadence of education, though his appearance suggested otherwise. Most remarkably, he never seemed bitter or angry, maintaining a quiet dignity that set him apart from the stereotype most people held about homelessness. But this morning, something was wrong. Richard wasn't in his usual alert posture. Instead, he was slumped against the wall at an odd angle, his breathing shallow and labored. His normally weathered but alert eyes were unfocused, staring at some point in the middle distance. "Rich!" Sarah called out, abandoning her hurried pace and crouching down beside him. "Are you okay?" Richard's attempt to respond came out as a weak mumble. His lips were turning blue, and Sarah could see that his hands were shaking uncontrollably. She immediately pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her legal training kicking in as she provided clear, concise information to the dispatcher. "I need an ambulance at 3rd Avenue and Pike Street," she said, her voice steady despite her growing panic. "I have a man here who appears to be suffering from hypothermia and possibly malnutrition. He's conscious but disoriented." While waiting for the paramedics, Sarah tried to keep Richard alert and warm, removing her own coat to cover him despite the falling rain. She talked to him continuously, telling him help was coming, asking him simple questions to gauge his mental state. What she didn't realize was that this moment of human kindness was about to trigger a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, and the paramedics immediately recognized the severity of Richard's condition. His core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and blood tests would later reveal significant malnutrition despite his access to soup kitchens and food banks. More concerning to the medical team was his apparent dehydration, suggesting he had been unable to care for himself for several days. "How long has he been like this?" asked Maria Santos, the lead paramedic, as her team prepared Richard for transport. "I don't know," Sarah replied, feeling guilty for not noticing sooner. "I see him every day, but today was the first time he seemed wrong." As the paramedics loaded Richard into the ambulance, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'm coming with you," she told Maria. "He doesn't have anyone else. If this story truly touches your heart, let's speak for you. Like this video, subscribe to be part of our journey, and share your feelings in the comments." At Harborview Medical Center, the emergency room team worked quickly to stabilize Richard's condition. Dr. Elena Martinez, the attending physician, had seen countless cases of homeless individuals brought in with similar symptoms, but something about Richard struck her as unusual. Despite his obvious physical distress, there was something about his demeanor, even in his weakened state, that suggested complexity beneath the surface. "We need to check his belongings for identification and emergency contacts," Dr. Martinez instructed her team. It was standard procedure, but what they found would turn a routine homeless intake into something unprecedented in the hospital's history. Nurse Jennifer Walsh was the one who made the discovery. As she carefully searched through Richard's possessions, looking for anything that might help them contact family or understand his medical history, her hands found the waterproof pouch hidden in his jacket's inner pocket. "Doctor," she called out, her voice carrying an odd note of confusion. "You need to see this." Dr. Martinez looked up from Richard's chart, expecting to see the usual collection of personal items, perhaps a worn photograph, expired identification, or medication bottles. Instead, Jennifer was holding what appeared to be a pristine leather wallet, containing multiple bank cards, all bearing the name Richard Morrison. "That's strange," Dr. Martinez murmured, taking the wallet and examining its contents more closely. "These look real, but—" Her voice trailed off as she opened a folded piece of paper tucked behind the bank cards. It was a recent investment account statement from Merrill Lynch, showing a portfolio balance of $4,247,381.23. The emergency room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital's perpetual activity. Dr. Martinez stared at the document, reading it twice to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding the numbers. "Get me the hospital administrator," she said quietly to Jennifer, "and call security to secure these belongings. We have a very unusual situation here." Within an hour, Richard's room had become the center of intense but discreet activity. Hospital administrators, social workers, and legal advisors all gathered to understand what they were dealing with. The man they had admitted as another homeless patient requiring emergency care was apparently a multimillionaire. Dr. Martinez had seen many strange cases during her 15 years in emergency medicine, but nothing quite like this. "We need to proceed very carefully," she told the assembled team. "This man's financial status doesn't change our medical obligations, but raises serious questions about his mental competency and decision-making capacity." Sarah had remained in the waiting room throughout Richard's initial treatment, periodically asking for updates and offering to provide any information she could about his daily life on the streets. When Dr. Martinez approached her several hours later, she could tell from the physician's expression that something significant had developed. "Miss Chun, I understand you've had regular contact with Mr. Morrison over the past few years," Dr. Martinez began carefully. "Can you tell me if he ever displayed signs of mental illness, confusion, or impaired judgment?" Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "Not at all," she replied. "Rich was always coherent, intelligent, well-spoken. He seemed sad sometimes, but never confused or unable to care for himself." "Why are you asking?" Dr. Martinez paused, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "We've discovered some information that complicates his case. I can't share specifics due to privacy laws, but I wonder if you'd be willing to speak with him once he's stable. He's been asking for the lady who called the ambulance, and it might help us understand the situation better." When Richard finally regained full consciousness 12 hours later, the first face he saw was Sarah's. She was sitting in a chair beside his hospital bed, reading a book and occasionally glancing at the monitors that tracked his vital signs. "You stayed," he said, his voice hoarse but much stronger than it had been that morning. "I was worried about you," Sarah replied simply. "How are you feeling?" "Better, embarrassed, grateful." Richard struggled to sit up slightly, and Sarah helped him adjust his pillows. "I'm sorry you had to see me like that. I try to be more careful about taking care of myself." It was then that Dr. Martinez entered the room, followed by Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's consulting psychiatrist. The moment Richard saw the serious expressions on their faces, he knew his secret was out. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Martinez began, "we need to discuss some items we found in your possession. For your own protection and to ensure we provide appropriate care, we had to inventory your belongings." Richard closed his eyes and took a deep breath. After 3 years of successfully hiding his true identity, the careful walls he had built around his double life were crumbling. "You found the wallet," he said. "It wasn't a question. We need to understand your situation," Dr. Williams interjected gently. "The financial documents we found suggest you have substantial resources, yet you've been living on the streets. We're concerned about your mental health and your ability to make decisions about your own care." Sarah looked back and forth between Richard and the doctors, trying to process what she was hearing. "What financial documents?" she asked. Richard turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something different in his eyes. Not the quiet peace she had grown accustomed to, but a deep, complex sadness that spoke of profound loss. "Sarah," he said quietly, "there are things about me you don't know, things I haven't told anyone in 3 years." Over the next 2 hours, as rain continued to hammer against the hospital windows, Richard Morrison told his story for the first time since he had walked away from his previous life. Dr. Williams recorded the session with his permission, recognizing that they were documenting something extraordinary. Richard had been born into a middle-class family in Portland, Oregon, in 1967. His father was an accountant, his mother a high school English teacher. They had instilled in him the values of hard work, education, and fiscal responsibility. Richard excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and the emerging field of computer science. He had graduated from the University of Washington in 1989 with degrees in computer science and business administration, just as the personal computer revolution was transforming the technology industry. His first job was with a small software development company in Seattle, where he quickly distinguished himself as both a talented programmer and an innovative thinker about commercial applications for emerging technologies. "I was in the right place at the right time," Richard explained to his captivated audience. The early 90s were an incredible period for anyone with technical skills and business sense. "I saw opportunities everywhere." In 1994, Richard had started his own company, developing software solutions for small businesses that wanted transition from paper-based systems to digital record-keeping. The company, Morrison System Solutions, had grown slowly but steadily, building a reputation for reliable, user-friendly products that didn't require extensive technical knowledge to implement. But Richard's real breakthrough had come in 1998, when he developed a cloud-based inventory management system years before cloud computing became a mainstream concept. The system allowed small retailers to track inventory, sales, and customer data from any internet-connected device, providing functionality that had previously been available only to large corporations with expensive IT departments. "I wasn't trying to revolutionize anything," Richard said. "I just saw that small business owners needed the same tools as big corporations, but in a format they could understand and afford." The timing was perfect. As internet adoption exploded in the early 2000s, Richard's system became increasingly valuable to businesses looking to compete in an increasingly digital marketplace. Major retailers began licensing his technology for their own operations, and venture capital firms started approaching him about expansion opportunities. Throughout this period of professional success, Richard's personal life had provided the stability and motivation that kept him grounded. He had married Margaret Walsh in 1992 after they met at a coffee shop near the University of Washington, where she was completing her master's degree in social work. Margaret had been the love of Richard's life. Intelligent, compassionate, and completely supportive of his entrepreneurial ambitions, even when they meant long hours and financial uncertainty. She had her own career working with at-risk youth, and together they had built a partnership that balanced professional achievement with genuine commitment to making their community better. Their daughter Emma had been born in 1995, and Richard's voice softened noticeably when he spoke about her. "Emma was everything Margaret and I hoped she would be," he told the assembled group. "Curious, kind, brilliant. She had Margaret's compassion and my analytical mind, but more than that, she had this incredible ability to see the best in everyone." Emma had excelled academically and socially throughout her childhood, eventually following her parents to the University of Washington, where she was studying environmental engineering with plans to work on sustainable technology solutions. She had been particularly interested in developing clean water systems for underserved communities, combining her technical aptitude with the social consciousness she had inherited from both parents. By 2015, Richard's company had grown into a significant player in the business software industry. When Amazon approached him about acquiring Morrison System Solutions to integrate with their own business services division, the offer was substantial enough to set Richard and his family up for life. "The sale price was $8.7 million, Richard said, his voice becoming more distant as he approached the difficult part of the story. "After taxes, lawyer fees, and employee bonuses, I walked away with about $5 million. Margaret, Emma, and I spent weeks talking about what we wanted to do with that kind of money." They had decided to maintain their modest lifestyle while using their new financial freedom to travel, support causes they cared about, and ensure that Emma could pursue any educational or career path she chose without worrying about student loans or financial pressure. Margaret had been particularly excited about the opportunity to expand her work with homeless youth, potentially starting a nonprofit organization focused on prevention and early intervention. "We were so naive," Richard said, his composure beginning to crack for the first time during his narration. "We thought having money meant we could control our future, protect ourselves from the bad things that happen to other people." The first crack in their perfect life had appeared in early 2016, when Margaret was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. The diagnosis had come during what should have been a routine gynecological exam, and the oncologist's initial prognosis had been cautiously optimistic with aggressive treatment. Margaret approached cancer the way she approached everything else, with research, determination, and complete focus on getting better. Richard remembered. "We found the best doctors, explored every treatment option, never even considered that she wouldn't beat it." The next 2 years had become a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, brief periods of hope when treatment seemed to be working, and devastating setbacks when the cancer proved more resilient than anyone had expected. Richard had stepped away from any professional commitments to become Margaret's full-time caregiver, while Emma had adjusted her academic schedule to spend as much time as possible with her mother. Even during the worst parts of her treatment, Margaret was thinking about other people, Richard said. She used our hospital stays to talk with other cancer patients, especially the ones who didn't have family support. She started an informal support group that met in the hospital cafeteria. She was planning to write a book about maintaining hope during serious illness. Margaret Morrison had died on March 15, 2018, surrounded by her husband and daughter, after a final battle with a cancer that had metastasized to her liver and lungs. Her funeral had drawn over 300 people, including many of the at-risk youth she had worked with over the years, colleagues from Richard's business career, and cancer patients who credited Margaret with helping them find strength during their own treatments. I thought losing Margaret was the worst thing that could ever happen to me, Richard continued, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. I couldn't imagine how life could get any harder. Emma and I leaned on each other, trying to figure out how to move forward without the person who had been the center of both our worlds. For 8 months, Richard and Emma had grieved together, slowly beginning to rebuild their lives around the enormous absence Margaret's death had left. Emma had returned to school for her senior year, while Richard had started seeing a therapist and considering whether he wanted to start another company or explore other ways of spending his time and resources. Then, on November 23rd, 2018, Emma Morrison had been driving home from a Thanksgiving dinner with college friends when her car was struck by a drunk driver on Interstate 5. She had died instantly, just 2 days after her 23rd birthday. The room fell silent, except for the quiet sounds of Richard's crying and the steady rhythm of the medical equipment. Sarah reached out and took his hand, tears streaming down her own face. Dr. Williams and Dr. Martinez sat in stunned silence, both recognizing that they were witnessing someone relive the most devastating losses imaginable. I buried my daughter 6 days before Christmas, Richard said when he was able to continue. Margaret's parents flew in from Ohio. Emma's friends came from college. But I felt like I was watching everything happen to someone else. I couldn't process that in 8 months, I had lost both of the people who made my life meaningful. The months following Emma's death had been a dark period that Richard could barely remember clearly. He had stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining his house, stopped answering phone calls or emails from concerned friends and business associates. The money that had once represented freedom and security now felt like a cruel joke. He had more financial resources than most people could dream of, but he couldn't use any of it to bring back the only things that truly mattered to him. I went to grief counseling, tried antidepressants, even spent a month traveling through Europe thinking that change of scenery might help. Richard said, nothing worked. I was living in this beautiful house filled with memories of Margaret and Emma, but I felt completely disconnected from life. The turning point had come in June 2019, during one of his aimless walks through downtown Seattle. Richard had been wandering the city frequently. Finding that movement helped quiet the constant mental spiral of grief and regret that plagued him when he stayed home. On this particular evening, he had stopped to buy coffee from a food truck and noticed a small group of homeless individuals gathered in a nearby park. There was this veteran named Tom Henderson, probably in his 60s, who was sharing a pizza with 3 other people. Richard remembered. I watched them for a while, and what struck me was how present they all were with each other. They weren't thinking about yesterday or tomorrow. They were focused on that shared pizza and the conversations they were having. Richard had approached the group tentatively, offering to buy them additional food. Tom had accepted graciously and invited Richard to sit with them. Over the next several hours, Richard had learned about their individual stories. Tom struggles with PTSD after Vietnam, Maria Santos' journey from domestic violence to life on the streets, Janet Williams' descent into homelessness after aging out of the foster care system. These people had experienced losses and traumas that in some ways paralleled mine. Richard said, but they had found ways to create community, to take care of each other, to find meaning in simple daily interactions. I realized I hadn't felt genuinely connected to other human beings since Emma died. Richard began visiting the downtown area regularly, not as a volunteer or charity worker, but simply as someone seeking human connection. He learned about the informal networks that sustain people living without traditional housing, which businesses would allow restroom access, where food banks operated, how to stay safe during cold weather. More importantly, he began to understand the psychology of people who have been forced to strip away all the conventional markers of success and identity. When you don't have a house or a job, or even a regular place to sleep, you discover what's actually essential, Richard explained. These people taught me that community, kindness, and purpose don't require money or stability. Over several months, Richard found himself spending more time downtown and less time in his Magnolia house. The contrast between his empty, memory-filled home and the vibrant, challenging, but authentic community he was discovering on the streets became increasingly stark. I started to realize that my grief wasn't just about losing Margaret and Emma, Richard said. It was about losing my sense of purpose, my understanding of what made life worth living. The house, the money, the comfortable lifestyle, none of that had meaning without the relationships that had made it worthwhile. The decision to leave his conventional life behind hadn't been impulsive. Richard had spent weeks preparing, setting up automatic systems to maintain his property and investments, arranging for his financial affairs to be managed remotely, and gradually reducing his possessions to what he could carry in a single backpack. I told myself it was temporary, Richard said. I thought I would spend a few months really understanding what it meant to live without financial security, learn from people who had figured out how to find meaning in circumstances I couldn't imagine enduring. But as Richard settled into life on the streets, he had discovered something unexpected. The daily challenges of finding food, shelter, and safety had forced him to focus on immediate, concrete needs rather than the abstract philosophical questions about purpose and meaning that had been tormenting him. The community he found among other homeless individuals had provided the human connection he desperately needed, without the complicated emotional baggage that came with his previous social relationships. For the first time since Margaret got sick, I wasn't thinking constantly about loss and grief, Richard explained. I was thinking about where I was going to sleep tonight, whether I had enough money for food, how I could help Janet find warm clothes for winter. The immediate needs were actually a relief from the emotional pain I hadn't been able to escape in my comfortable house. Dr. Williams, who had been taking notes throughout Richard's story, looked up with a thoughtful expression. So the choice to live on the streets wasn't the result of mental illness or cognitive impairment. It was a conscious decision to find a different way of processing grief and discovering meaning. That's right, Richard confirmed. I wasn't running away from responsibility or trying to punish myself. I was trying to learn something I couldn't learn any other way. Sarah, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke up. But Rich, you had options. You could have traveled, started a foundation, gone back to school, found any number of ways to create purpose and community without giving up everything you'd worked for. Richard smiled sadly. You're right, Sarah. And for most people, those would have been better choices. But I needed something more radical. I needed to discover whether I could find meaning when everything familiar was stripped away. I needed to know if the person I had been before losing Margaret and Emma was resilient enough to survive without all the external supports that had defined my life. The conversation continued for another hour, with Richard describing his 3 years on the streets in detail that revealed both the hardships and the unexpected gifts of his unconventional choice. He spoke about learning to sleep in doorways and under bridges, about navigating the complex social dynamics of the homeless community, about discovering reserves of physical and emotional strength he hadn't known he possessed. The first winter was brutal, he admitted. I lost 15 pounds, got pneumonia twice, and seriously considered going back to my house at least once a week. But every time I thought about giving up, someone in the community would do something that reminded me why I was there. He described how Maria Santos had shared her blanket with him during a particularly cold snap, even though she had been living on the streets for 2 years and knew better than anyone how precious warm bedding could be. He talked about Janet Williams teaching him which dumpsters behind restaurants contained edible food and which areas of downtown were safe for sleeping. Most memorably, he spoke about Tom Henderson, the veteran who had unknowingly inspired his transformation. Tom became like a father figure to me, Richard said. He had this incredible ability to find dignity and purpose even in the most difficult circumstances. He'd spend his days looking for veterans who were struggling with homelessness, connecting them with services, teaching them survival skills. He never had more than a few dollars to his name, but he was one of the most generous people I've ever known. Richard also described the gradual process by which he had found his niche within the downtown homeless community. His education and business background had made him valuable as someone who could help others navigate bureaucratic systems, filling out applications for benefits, understanding legal documents, communicating with social workers and healthcare providers. I became the guy people came to when they needed help with paperwork or when they had questions about their rights, Richard said. It felt good to be useful in a concrete way, to have skills that could make other people's lives a little easier. As Richard's story unfolded, Dr. Martinez and Dr. Williams began to understand that they were dealing with a situation far more complex than typical cases of homelessness. This wasn't a man who had fallen through society's safety nets due to mental illness, addiction, or economic hardship. Instead, Richard had made a conscious choice to step outside conventional society as a way of processing profound grief and discovering authentic meaning. "I need to ask you directly," Dr. Williams said. "Do you believe your decision to live on the streets has been beneficial to your mental health and overall well-being?" Richard considered the question carefully. "It's been the hardest thing I've ever done, but yes, I think it saved my life. When I was living in my house, drowning in grief and isolation, I was having thoughts about suicide almost daily. The money felt meaningless. The comfortable lifestyle felt like a mockery of everything I had lost." He paused, looking out the hospital window at the city, where he had spent the last 3 years learning to survive in ways he never could have imagined. "Living on the streets forced me to focus on immediate survival instead of dwelling on loss. The community I found gave me purpose and connection that I hadn't been able to create any other way. Most importantly, I learned that I could endure much more hardship than I ever thought possible, which helped me believe that I could eventually endure the emotional pain of losing Margaret and Emma." Sarah listened to this explanation with growing amazement and concern. The Richard she had known on the streets had indeed seemed different from other homeless individuals she had encountered. More peaceful, more articulate, more genuinely content despite his circumstances. Now she understood why. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Are you planning to go back to the streets when you're discharged?" It was a question Richard had been wrestling with since regaining consciousness. The media attention his story was already generating. Word had leaked from hospital staff, and local news outlets were beginning to investigate. Meant that his anonymous life on the streets was no longer possible. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to return to the community that saved my life. But I also recognize that I've learned what I came to learn. I know now that I can find meaning and connection even in the most difficult circumstances. I know that my worth as a person isn't dependent on financial success or comfortable living conditions." Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you've processed your grief in a very unconventional but ultimately successful way. The question now is whether you can integrate those lessons into a lifestyle that allows you to use your resources to help others while maintaining the personal growth you've achieved." Over the next several days, as Richard recovered his physical strength and the media attention surrounding his story intensified, he found himself at the center of a national conversation about wealth, purpose, and the nature of success in American society. The story had first broken in the Seattle Times, with a headline that captured the public's fascination. "Millionaire chose streets over mansion to process grief." From there, it had been picked up by national news outlets, social media influencers, and talk show hosts, each offering their own interpretation of Richard's choices. Some critics argued that Richard's decision was selfish and irresponsible, suggesting that his presence on the streets had taken resources away from people who truly needed help. "This man had the privilege of choice," wrote one columnist. "Real homeless people don't get to decide whether they want to live in poverty." His story romanticizes suffering that isn't voluntary for millions of Americans. Others saw Richard's story as a powerful commentary on the emptiness that material success can bring and the importance of community and purpose over financial achievement. Richard Morrison discovered what philosophers and spiritual teachers have been telling us for centuries, argued a psychology professor interviewed by CNN. "True wealth isn't about money. It's about meaningful relationships and authentic connection to something larger than yourself." The homeless advocacy community was divided in their response. Some organizations worried that Richard's story would perpetuate stereotypes about homeless people being responsible for their own circumstances, potentially reducing public support for services and housing programs. Others appreciated the attention his story brought to issues of homelessness and the complexity of individual circumstances that could lead someone to life on the streets. Richard's story shows that homelessness isn't always about mental illness or addiction, said Jennifer Walsh, director of the Downtown Emergency Service Center, in an interview with the Washington Post. "Sometimes it's about people searching for something they can't find in conventional society." His experience also demonstrates the strength and community that exists among people experiencing homelessness, qualities that house people often overlook. The individuals who had lived alongside Richard were also thrust into the spotlight, though most declined media interviews. Tom Henderson, the veteran who had unknowingly inspired Richard's transformation, was one of few who agreed to speak publicly about their relationship. I always knew Rich was different, Tom told a local television reporter. He talked like an educated man, understood things about business and politics that seemed unusual for someone in his situation. But he never acted superior or made us feel like he was slumming it. He was genuinely trying to understand our world, and he contributed to our community in real ways. Maria Santos, the woman who had shared blankets with Richard during cold nights, expressed mixed feelings about the revelation. "I'm glad Rich was never actually in danger of starving or freezing to death," she said. "But I'm also sad that he felt he had to deceive us about who he was. We would have accepted him regardless of his money." As the media frenzy continued, Richard found himself struggling with questions about his future that he hadn't fully anticipated. The anonymous life on the streets that had provided him with healing and community was no longer possible. Social workers, journalists, and curiosity seekers would always know who he was now. But Richard had also come to understand that the peace he had found wasn't entirely dependent on living in poverty. The lessons he had learned about community, resilience, and finding meaning in simple daily interactions could potentially be maintained even if he returned to a more conventional lifestyle. "I realized that my transformation wasn't really about the money or the lack of money," Richard explained to Dr. Williams during one of their final sessions before his hospital discharge. "It was about learning to live authentically, to focus on what truly matters, and to find community with people who value me for who I am rather than what I own." The decision about Richard's future became more urgent when Sarah made an unexpected proposal during one of her daily visits to the hospital. As their friendship had deepened through the revelation of his true story, she had been thinking about ways he could maintain the lessons he'd learned while also using his resources more effectively. "What if you didn't have to choose between having money and living authentically?" Sarah asked one afternoon, pulling a chair closer to his hospital bed. "What if there was a way to honor what you've learned while also making a bigger impact on the issues you've come to care about?" Sarah had been researching innovative approaches to homelessness and poverty, driven partly by her growing friendship with Richard and partly by her own evolving understanding of social justice issues. She had discovered several organizations around the country that were experimenting with community-based approaches to addressing homelessness, programs that emphasize dignity, choice, and mutual support rather than traditional top-down charity models. "There's this organization in Portland called Dignity Village," Sarah explained, showing Richard articles on her laptop. "It's a self-governed homeless community where people have individual spaces but share resources and decision-making. They've created their own economy, their own rules, their own support systems. It's not perfect, but it addresses some of the community aspects you found so valuable on the streets." Richard studied the information with growing interest. Dignity Village and similar programs represented a middle path between the complete rejection of conventional society that he had chosen and the return to isolated wealth that he was dreading. "What are you thinking?" he asked Sarah. "I'm thinking that maybe your real calling isn't to live in poverty or to return to your old life," she said. "Maybe it's to use your resources and your experience to create new models for community, purpose, and mutual support. You could help other people who are struggling with loss, isolation, or the meaninglessness that comes with conventional success." The idea began to crystallize over the following days as Richard met with various advisors and advocates who had requested meetings after learning about his story. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a social worker who specialized in innovative housing programs, visited to discuss her research on intentional communities for people transitioning out of homelessness. Traditional homeless services focus on moving people through a system, from streets to shelters to housing to employment, Dr. Vasquez explained. But that model assumes everyone wants the same thing and defines success in very narrow terms. What if we created spaces where people could choose their own definitions of success while still having access to support and community? Richard found himself energized by these conversations in ways he hadn't experienced since his early entrepreneurial days. The combination of his business skills, his financial resources, and his lived experience with both conventional success and street-level survival gave him a unique perspective on problems that traditional approaches hadn't solved. But he was also acutely aware of the potential pitfalls. "I don't want to become someone who swoops in with money and good intentions, thinking I can solve problems I don't really understand," he told Dr. Williams. "I've learned too much about the complexity of homelessness and poverty to believe that wealth alone can fix anything." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. The fact that you're aware of that danger suggests you're unlikely to fall into it. Your experience on the streets has given you insights that most wealthy philanthropists never develop. The question is how to use those insights responsibly. As Richard's discharge date approached, the media attention began to shift from sensationalized curiosity about the millionaire homeless man to more substantive discussions about wealth, purpose, and social responsibility. Richard had declined most interview requests, but he agreed to participate in a single televised conversation with a respected journalist known for thoughtful coverage of social issues. The interview, conducted in a conference room at the hospital to accommodate Richard's ongoing recovery, became a defining moment in how the public understood his story. Rather than focusing on the shock value of his situation, the journalist explored the deeper questions his experience raised about American society's relationship with money and success. Do you think your story says something about the inadequacy of traditional measures of success? The journalist asked. Richard considered the question carefully. I think it says something about the danger of defining success purely in external terms, he replied. I had achieved everything our society tells us we should want. Financial security, professional recognition, a beautiful home. But when I lost the relationships that gave my life meaning, all of that external success fell hollow. He paused, looking directly into the camera. I'm not suggesting that everyone should give up their possessions and live on the streets. That was my particular path through grief and discovery. But I do think we need to have honest conversations about what actually makes life worth living and whether our economic system supports or undermines the things that truly matter. The interview also addressed criticisms of Richard's choices, particularly arguments that his decision to live on the streets was a form of privilege that real homeless people don't enjoy. I understand that criticism, and I think it's partially valid, Richard acknowledged. I always had the safety net of my hidden wealth, which meant I was never in real danger of permanent harm. That's a form of privilege that most people experiencing homelessness don't have. But he also pushed back against the suggestion that his experience was therefore meaningless or inappropriate. The community I found on the streets was real. The lessons I learned about resilience, mutual support, and finding purpose in difficult circumstances were genuine. The friendships I built were authentic, even though I wasn't completely honest about my financial situation. Richard's most powerful moment in the interview came when he spoke directly to viewers who might be struggling with their own questions about purpose and meaning. If you're feeling like your life lacks meaning despite material success, or if you're dealing with loss and don't know how to move forward, I want you to know that there are paths through that darkness, he said. My particular path was extreme and probably not right for most people. But the underlying lesson, that purpose comes from connection, community, and service to others. That's something anyone can pursue regardless of their financial situation. Following the interview's broadcast, Richard received hundreds of letters and emails from people sharing their own struggles with grief, meaninglessness, and the search for authentic purpose. Many came from wealthy individuals who felt trapped by their success, unable to find meaning in lives that looked perfect from the outside. Others came from people who had experienced profound losses and were searching for ways to rebuild their lives around new definitions of meaning and success. One letter particularly moved Richard. It came from a woman named Linda Patterson, whose husband had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving her with substantial life insurance money that felt meaningless in the face of her loss. I've been thinking about giving away all the money and starting over, Linda wrote. Your story helped me realize that I don't have to choose between having resources and living authentically. Maybe the question isn't how to get rid of wealth, but how to use it in ways that honor what I've learned about what really matters. These responses helped Richard understand that his story resonated not because of its sensational aspects, but because it addressed questions that many people were asking privately about success, purpose, and how to live meaningfully in a society that often prioritizes material achievement over personal fulfillment. As Richard prepared to leave the hospital, he had reached several important decisions about his future. First, he would not return to his old life of isolated wealth and comfortable meaninglessness. Second, he would not go back to living on the streets, recognizing that his media attention had made that impossible and that he had learned what he needed to learn from that experience. Instead, Richard decided to pursue the middle path that his conversations with Sarah and various advocates had suggested. He would use his financial resources to create new models for community and mutual support, while maintaining the personal values and relationships he had discovered during his time on the streets. His first step was to establish the Morrison Foundation for Intentional Community, with a mission of supporting innovative approaches to homelessness, grief recovery, and community building. Unlike traditional charitable foundations that operated from a distance, Richard planned to remain personally involved in the programs the foundation supported, bringing his lived experience to complement his financial resources. The foundation's first project will be the development of a community space in downtown Seattle, where people transitioning out of homelessness could choose their own paths toward stability and purpose, rather than following a one-size-fits-all model. The program would offer various options, from traditional housing and job placement to intentional community living and alternative economic arrangements. We want to create a place where someone like Tom Henderson can pursue his calling to help other veterans without having to worry about having a roof over his head, Richard explained to Sarah as they walked through a potential property for the program. But we also want to support people who are interested in more conventional paths to stability. Richard also made a personal decision that surprised many people who had followed his story. Rather than returning to his large house in Magnolia, he sold the property and bought a modest apartment in a mixed-income neighborhood near downtown Seattle. The apartment was comfortable but simple, and its location allowed him to maintain connections with the community he had discovered on the streets. "I learned that I don't need much space or luxury to be happy," Richard explained. "But I also learned that complete rejection of material comfort isn't necessary for authentic living. This apartment gives me what I need without the isolation and excess that made me miserable before." The sale of his house provided additional resources for the foundation, but more importantly, it represented Richard's commitment to living according to the values he had discovered rather than simply talking about them. 6 months after his hospitalization, Richard hosted the first community meeting for his new foundation. The gathering took place in a rented space in Pioneer Square, and the attendees reflected the diverse community he had envisioned. Formerly homeless individuals like Tom, Maria, and Janet, social workers and advocates, wealthy donors interested in innovative approaches to social problems, and people like Linda Patterson, who were searching for ways to use their resources more meaningfully. Tom Henderson, now serving as a paid consultant to help design programs for homeless veterans, spoke at the meeting about the changes he had observed in the downtown community since Richard's story became public. Rich's story helped people understand that the folks living on the streets aren't just problems to be solved. Tom said, "We're human beings with our own insights, experiences, and contributions to make. The foundation is the first program I've seen that actually listens to what we have to say about what would be helpful." Maria Santos had accepted a position as a community outreach coordinator for the foundation, using her years of experience navigating street life to help others transition to more stable situations. "What I like about this approach is that it doesn't assume everyone wants the same thing," she said. "Some people want traditional apartments and jobs. Others want to live in community with shared resources. Some people need intensive support. Others just need a chance to contribute their skills. We're trying to create options instead of forcing people through a single system." Sarah Chun had also become deeply involved with the foundation, taking a leave of absence from her law firm to serve as its legal counsel and strategic advisor. Her friendship with Richard had evolved into a partnership focused on creating sustainable, replicable models for community-based approaches to social problems. "What we're trying to do is scale up the kinds of mutual support and genuine community that Richard discovered on the streets," Sarah explained to the group. "We're not trying to romanticize homelessness or suggest that living in poverty is desirable, but we are trying to learn from the resilience, creativity, and solidarity that people develop when they don't have traditional safety nets." The foundation's first residential program opened a year later in a converted warehouse that provided both private living spaces and extensive common areas for community activities. Residents included people transitioning out of homelessness, individuals dealing with grief or major life transitions, and a few people like Richard who were interested in exploring intentional community, living despite having other housing options available. The program operated on principles that reflected Richard's hard-won insights about community and authentic living. Residents participated in collective decision-making about community policies. Everyone contributed to community through work, whether paid employment outside the facility, volunteer services, or contributions to the community's internal operations. Most importantly, the program emphasized choice and self-determination rather than compliance with predetermined treatment or housing plans. We're trying to create a place where people can heal, grow, and contribute according to their own values and goals, Richard explained during a tour for potential funders. Some residents use this as a stepping stone to independent housing and traditional employment. Others find that community living suits them long-term. Both choices are valid. One resident, a former software engineer named David Kim who had experienced homelessness after a combination of job loss and mental health struggles, described the program's impact on his recovery. Traditional homeless services wanted to get me housed and employed as quickly as possible, which makes sense from their perspective, David said. But I needed time to address the depression and anxiety that had contributed to my situation in the first place. Here, I've been able to focus on my mental health while also contributing my technical skills to help other residents and community organizations. I'm not ready for independent living yet, but I'm making progress at my own pace. The program also attracted residents who weren't homeless, but were seeking alternatives to conventional living arrangements. Jennifer Walsh, a recent college graduate struggling with student debt and uncertain about her career path, moved into the community as a way of reducing living expenses while exploring her interests in social work and community organizing. My parents think I'm crazy for choosing to live here when I could afford a studio apartment, Jennifer said. But I've learned more about social justice, community building, and myself in 6 months here than I did in 4 years of college. Plus, my housing costs are minimal, which gives me the freedom to do work I care about instead of just taking the highest paying job I can find. Richard's own living situation reflected his ongoing commitment to the values he had discovered on the streets. He maintained his small apartment, but spent several nights each week staying at the community residence, participating in collective meals, community meetings, and informal social activities. I don't want to be someone who funds programs from a distance, Richard explained. The relationships and daily interactions are what made street life meaningful for me, and they're what make this community work. If I isolated myself in my apartment and just wrote checks, I'd be recreating the same problems that led me to the streets in the first place. Richard's approach to wealth had also evolved significantly. Rather than treating his money as something to be preserved and grown, he viewed it as a tool for creating the kinds of communities and relationships that he had learned to value. He lived modestly, spending far less than his investment income generated, but he was generous in funding programs and supporting individuals who shared a commitment to authentic community building. I used to think about money in terms of security and independence, Richard reflected. Now I think about it in terms of interdependence and mutual support. The goal isn't to accumulate wealth, but to use whatever resources I have to strengthen the communities I'm part of. This philosophy extended to his approach to the foundation's operations. Rather than maintaining traditional donor-recipient relationships, Richard structured the foundation as a collaborative effort where people with various types of resources, financial, experiential, professional, work together as equals to address shared concerns. Tom Henderson, who had become one of Richard's closest advisors, described the difference this approach made in his own life and work. Most charity programs treat people like me as beneficiaries who should be grateful for whatever help we're offered, Tom said. Here, my experience and insights are valued as much as Richard's money or Sarah's legal expertise. We're all contributing different things, but we're all partners in trying to create something better. The Foundation's programs gradually expanded beyond residential services to include job training, mental health support, advocacy for policy changes, and research on alternative economic models. Each new program was developed through extensive consultation with the communities it was intended to serve, ensuring that services reflected actual needs rather than assumptions about what help should look like. Dr. Patricia Williams, the psychiatrist who had first evaluated Richard's mental competency, became a consultant to Foundation's mental health programs. She was particularly interested in Richard's journey as a case study in unconventional approaches to processing grief and trauma. Richard's story challenges traditional assumptions about recovery from major losses, Dr. Williams explained in a professional journal article about the Foundation's work. His choice to deliberately experience material hardship as a way of processing grief was extreme, but it led to genuine healing and personal growth. The community-based programs he's created offer less radical but still innovative approaches for people seeking alternatives to individualistic models of recovery. The foundation also began attracting attention from researchers and policymakers interested in alternative approaches to homelessness and poverty. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the social worker who had consulted with Richard during his hospital stay, conducted a formal evaluation of the foundation's residential program after its first 2 years of operation. Her findings challenged several assumptions about homeless services and community-based programming. Residents of the foundation's community showed higher rates of long-term housing stability compared to people served by traditional programs, but they also showed less interest in conventional employment and more involvement in volunteer activities, creative pursuits, and informal economic arrangements. The program succeeds if you define success as personal autonomy, community engagement, and subjective well-being, Dr. Vasquez wrote in her evaluation report. It's less successful if you define success purely in terms of employment income and independent housing. This raises important questions about whose values should determine what constitutes successful outcomes. These findings sparked debate within the social services community about the goals and methods of homeless assistance. Some advocates argue that programs like Richard's Foundation represented important innovations that respected individual choice and community values. Others worry that such programs might reduce pressure for systemic changes that could address the root causes of homelessness and poverty. Richard engaged thoughtfully with these debates, recognizing that his foundation's work was part of a larger conversation about social change and economic justice. "We're not trying to replace efforts for policy change or economic reform," he said during a conference presentation, "but we also can't wait for systemic solutions to help people who are struggling right now." Community-based programs can provide immediate support while also demonstrating alternative ways of organizing economic and social relationships. As the foundation's work gained national recognition, Richard found himself in the unexpected role of spokesperson for values-based approaches to social problems. He was invited to speak at conferences, consult with other organizations, and participate in policy discussions about homelessness and community development. But Richard was careful to avoid becoming separated from the day-to-day realities of the communities he served. He maintained his practice of spending time at the residential facility, participating in community meals and meetings, and staying connected with people like Tom, Maria, and Janet, who had taught him so much during his years on the streets. "The moment I start thinking of myself as an expert rather than participant, I'll lose touch with what made this work meaningful in the first place," Richard said. "My value comes from the combination of resources and lived experience, not from either one alone." 3 years after leaving the hospital, Richard received a letter that brought his journey full circle. It came from Emma's college roommate, Jessica Martinez, who had maintained occasional contact with Richard after his daughter's death, but had lost touch during his years on the streets. "I heard about your story through a friend who works in social services," Jessica wrote. "I wanted you to know that what you're doing would make Emma so proud. She always talked about wanting to use her engineering skills to help underserved communities. And in a way, you're carrying on that vision through your foundation's work." Jessica's letter reminded Richard that his transformation hadn't been just about his own healing. It had also been about finding ways to honor the values and dreams of the people he had lost. Margaret's commitment to helping vulnerable populations and Emma's interest in sustainable, community-based solutions to social problems were reflected in the Foundation's approach to its work. Richard shared Jessica's letter with the Foundation's community during one of their regular evening gatherings. The group had grown to include not just residents and staff, but also neighbors, volunteers, and friends who appreciated the opportunity to participate in intentional community building. "I started this journey thinking I needed to lose everything to find meaning," Richard told the assembled group. "What I learned instead was that meaning comes from connection, community, and using whatever resources you have, whether that's money, experience, skills, or just willingness to show up, in service of values you really believe in." Tom Henderson, now in his 70s but still actively involved in the Foundation's veteran services, nodded in recognition. "That's what I tried to tell you when you first showed up downtown," he said with a smile. "You were looking for something you already had, the ability to connect with people and contribute to community. You just needed to learn how to see it." Sarah Chun, whose friendship with Richard had deepened through their shared work, reflected on how much both of their lives had changed since that morning when she found Richard collapsed on the sidewalk. "I used to think success meant climbing the corporate ladder and accumulating wealth," Sarah said. "Working with the foundation has taught me that real success looks more like the relationships we build and the communities we create. I'm practicing law differently now, focusing on clients and cases that align with my values instead of just pursuing profit." The foundation's impact extended beyond its direct programs to influence how Richard and his collaborators approached all aspects of their lives. The values of community, mutual support, and authentic purpose that had emerged from Richard's time on the streets became organizing principles that shaped decisions about work, relationships, and resource allocation. Dr. Williams, who had continued to consult with the foundation while maintaining her private practice, observed that Richard's story had influenced her approach to therapy and mental health treatment. "Richard's journey showed me the importance of meaning-making and community connection in recovery from trauma," she said. "I now spend more time helping clients think about values and purpose, not just symptom reduction. I also refer more clients to community-based programs that offer social connection alongside individual therapy." As Richard approached his 5th year since leaving the streets, he had created a life that successfully integrated the lessons he had learned with the resources he possessed. He lived simply but comfortably, maintained deep relationships with a diverse community, and used his wealth to support programs that reflected his values. The foundation had grown to support multiple residential communities, job training programs, and advocacy efforts across the Pacific Northwest. But Richard measured its success not by size or scale, but by the stories of individuals whose lives had been touched by its work. People like David Kim, the former software engineer who had used the foundation's residential program as a foundation for rebuilding his life and career, but who chose to remain involved as a volunteer because of the community connections he had formed. People like Jennifer Walsh, the recent college graduate who had discovered her calling in community organizing and was now pursuing a master's degree in social work while continuing to live in intentional community. People like Linda Patterson, the widow who had reached out to Richard after his television interview and who had established her own foundation focused on grief support and meaning-making after major losses. Each person's story is different, Richard reflected during a quiet conversation with Sarah one evening as they walked the neighborhood where his apartment was located. But what they have in common is a recognition that healing, growth, and authentic purpose happen in relationship with other people, not in isolation. Sarah nodded, thinking about her own transformation from a career-focused attorney to someone whose professional life was integrated with her values and community commitments. "I think that's what made your story resonate with so many people," she said. "It wasn't really about the money or the homelessness. It was about the universal human need for connection and meaning." As they walked, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought him from isolated grief to community engagement, from meaningless wealth to purposeful resource sharing, from the desire to escape his previous life to commitment to create better alternatives. "I used to think the choice was between having money and living authentically," Richard said. "What I learned was that authenticity isn't about what you have or don't have. It's about how you choose to live with whatever circumstances you find yourself in." Richard's story had become part of a growing national conversation about wealth inequality, community resilience, and alternative definitions of success. His foundation's work was cited in policy discussions about homelessness, studied by researchers interested in community-based approaches to social problems, and replicated by other organizations seeking to create more holistic support systems. But for Richard himself, the most meaningful measure of his journey's impact was found in the daily interactions and relationships that gave his life texture and purpose. The community meals where residents, neighbors, and volunteers shared food and conversation. The planning meetings where people with different backgrounds collaborated on solutions to shared challenges. The quiet conversations where individuals processing their own losses or transitions found support and understanding. If you made it all the way here, it means this story truly held you. So don't leave without showing some love. Hit like, subscribe to stay with us, and drop a comment. I'll be here, reading every word you share. Tom Henderson, who had remained Richard's closest friend and advisor throughout his transformation, summed up the impact of Richard's unconventional journey during a celebration marking the Foundation's 5th anniversary. "Rich taught us that the question isn't whether you're homeless or housed. rich or poor, Tom said to the assembled crowd of community members, supporters, and collaborators. The question is whether you're living according to your values, contributing to your community, and staying connected to what really matters. Rich figured out how to do that with $4 million, but the same principles work whether you've got $4 million or $4. As applause filled the room, Richard looked around at the faces of people whose lives had intersected with his own in ways he never could have planned or predicted. The wealthy donors who had been inspired to rethink their own relationships with money. The formerly homeless individuals who had become leaders and advocates. The social workers and therapists who had adapted their practices based on lessons learned from community-based approaches. Each person represented a different aspect of the complex web of relationships and mutual influence that had grown from Richard's decision to abandon his isolated wealth in search of authentic meaning. None of them, including Richard himself, had ended up exactly where they might have expected, but all had discovered ways of living that honored their deepest values while contributing to the well-being of others. The homeless man who had shocked everyone when they discovered his true identity had ultimately revealed something more important than his hidden wealth. He had demonstrated that true richness comes not from what you accumulate, but from what you contribute, not from what you own, but from whom you serve, and not from the security of isolation, but from the vulnerability and reward of authentic community. In choosing to share his story, Richard had given others permission to question their own assumptions about success, to prioritize relationships over possessions, and to believe that it's possible to create lives of meaning and purpose regardless of their starting circumstances. His journey from millionaire to homeless man to community builder had shown that the path to authentic fulfillment is rarely straight, never simple, but always possible for those courageous enough to choose connection over comfort and purpose over profit. As the celebration continued around him, Richard felt the deep satisfaction that comes from living according to your values while surrounded by people who share your commitment to building a better world. It was a feeling he had never experienced during his years of conventional success, had discovered during his time on the streets, and had learned to sustain through the patient work of creating communities based on mutual respect, shared resources, and authentic care for one another's well-being. The man who had once lost everything had ultimately found something far more valuable than anything money could buy, a life of genuine meaning lived in authentic relationship with others who understood that true wealth lies not in what you possess, but in what you give away.